Hello there, Drew Hanish of Whiskey Lore, and time for another whiskey tasting. And today I am doing the second whiskey in the Bonded series, just released by Jack Daniel's. And this is one called Triple Mash. And by looking at the bottle, you may say, oh, wait a second, is that bottled in bond? Yes, it is. It is 100 proof. It is 50% alcohol by volume. Comes in a similar bottle to the one we had for the Bonded bottle, an homage to the 1895 bottle that Lem Motlow and Jack Daniel put out. This one, though, is a different concept from the Bonded whiskey that I covered just a couple days ago. This one is a blended Tennessee, blended straight whiskey. Let's call it that. It's not a Tennessee whiskey, and I'm going to explain why it is not a Tennessee whiskey. Basically, in 2011, Jack Daniel moved on to a second mash bill. Their second mash bill beyond Tennessee whiskey was their rye mash bill. And that rye mash bill was 70% rye, 12% malted barley, 18% corn. Then 2 years later, they started experimenting by doing a single malt. In other words, a malted barley whiskey, 100% malted barley whiskey, and seeing what they could do with that. Well, over time, they put these whiskeys into casks and they let them start to age. Something else that they did with these whiskeys that you probably haven't seen too much of is that they also did the Lincoln County process on them. So we're talking about they're making an American Single Malt on a column still rather than a pot still, and they're using the charcoal filtering leaching process called the Lincoln County process on that American Single Malt. And then they were also, at the same time, of course they have been doing this for a while, creating their rye whiskey, same sort of way. So in talking to Chris Fletcher, he said he really wasn't a big fan of the idea of creating a blended bourbon or a blended whiskey or blended Tennessee whiskey, whatever we want to call it. But that it got to a point where it was like, hey, this is something, maybe we should try it, see what we come up with. So what this whiskey is it is 3 different bonded whiskeys, one being the, which comprises 60% of this, is the rye whiskey. So yes, he chose to make the rye whiskey the main component of this, and then 20% of the American Single Malt, and then 20% of Tennessee whiskey, all 3 of them bottled in bond. So there's only one other, and maybe there are others, there's only one other distillery that I can think of that has created a bottled in bond blend, which would be Chattanooga whiskey with their bottled in bond, which contains 4 different high malt recipes. And so they've done a couple of series of those whiskeys, but this is actually taking 3 completely different styles of whiskey and blending them together. So it's an interesting experiment. And so I'm going to do a tasting on this and let you know a little bit more about it. The whiskeys in here are aged a little longer than the bonded whiskey is. These are aged for around 5.5 years. And so I actually, as I was thinking about it, I was going, okay, wait a second now. I have to do math here because we're talking about you're using 60% rye, 20% American Single Malt, 100 or 20% of the Tennessee whiskey, and they all have their own mash bills. So I factored everything together, and then it was a crazy formula. Sometimes when I'm just sitting by myself, I come up with these nutso ways of coming to solutions. But anyway, what I did was I basically said, okay, let me take, if rye has 70% rye in it, and this is 60 percent of the recipe, I will multiply it by 6. I'll just drop the 0 and multiply it by 6, and then I will end up with a number, and I will do the same for the amount of malted barley and the same amount for, and just multiply by 20. Anyway, complicated formula. I did all the addition, then ended up dropping a 0 off to get it into the 100% territory. This is what I came up with. This whiskey has 43.6% rye, 29.6% malted barley, and 26.8% corn. So it's really interesting because it is a higher rye content, but it really couldn't be called a rye whiskey because it's not 51% or more rye. So it's 43.6% rye. And then the second ingredient in there is going to be the malted barley. The malted barley has got quite a hefty portion, and corn comes in third. So it's a really interesting mash bill when you put it together. And now that you kind of have a sense of what's in this glass, let's go ahead and do a nosing and tasting of Jack Daniel's Triple Mash. So the first thing I notice is that the nose is a bit lighter on this one. The color is lighter as well versus the bonded whiskey. There's a little char in there, bit of oak, bit of that rye, but amazingly, when we're talking about the bonded was only 8% rye, but the rye really took over the experience. And on this, even with 43.6% rye, the rye is just very soft and subtle in here. Slightly herbally. Because of the lighter color and the longer age, I would imagine that these barrels have not gone through the same intensity that the bottles that came out of that went into the bonded would be. A little honey, there's a little baking spice in there, a little caramel pops in. But really it's kind of a blend between that Herbaly Rye and the oak again, but it's very, very, very subtle. Cheers. The rye shows up on the palate. There's a fruity note in there, kind of an apricot flavor that comes in. A little caramel on there. Peppery, but not overly peppery. Both this and the bonded are very drinkable. The herbaliness of the rye picks up on the finish, and so does the oak. The oak comes in on the finish as well. It's much more of a subtle kind of a experience in terms of the flavor notes in there. It's not as in your face as the bonded is. A little bit, again, of baking spice in there, maybe a hint of mint actually coming in there, something reminding me of mint there on the finish. And I was trying to see if I was pulling that cola note out of this as well. Everything is just a little bit more subtle in this whiskey. And it's interesting because when it was introduced to us, we actually got a chance to taste each of the individual components on their own. So again, we were amongst the first to really get to taste what Jack Daniel's American Single Malt is going to taste like versus what the rye tastes like and the Tennessee whiskey. And the Tennessee whiskey that's used in this is much closer to the Tennessee whiskey that was in the travel retail version of Bottled and Bond. It's basically Old Number 7, just proof to 50% alcohol. And so It's interesting because there's so much malted barley in this. I think that running malted barley through a column still is kind of taking away some flavors. And I'm going to try to explain this in a Scotch drinker's kind of way. When you are making whiskey in a pot still, when you're making a single malt in a pot still, you have the ability to choose your range that you want to take that whiskey off the still. So when it's running through the still and then it's coming off the still, you're basically watching as the heads come off, and the heads are that really high proof alcohol, methanol, you don't want to drink. It's just not good for you at all. And then you're trying to find that spot where you get the hearts, and then you want to cut off those hearts at a point as you start getting into the tails, because you get into the congeners, you get into the stuff that can go from interesting to funky. And so when you're doing a pot still distillation of a single malt, what you're ending up with is a less precise kind of a cut. In other words, you're saying, okay, I'm going to cut this up here because I feel like the hearts or the heads run is done. We're getting into the hearts. Well, you're not pulling in a specific proof. You are pulling in what could be going over the line a little this way and going over the line a little this way. Now, on the upper end, it probably doesn't matter as much. Where it does matter is once you start getting to your lower end of this, and you're saying, okay, where all these things called congeners are in the tails, how far do I go in before it's going to get too funky that I don't want to taste it? And so this is where they have the ability to kind of make a decision and say, okay, we got to a certain point, and let's go ahead and cut it here. Now, again, you're going to not have a precise kind of a cut. It may be getting a little bit of congeners, it may be getting some of the hearts in that position that you are cutting this in. Whereas on a column still, you can say, I want to take a very precise range here. So you are basically distilling until you get the exact hearts that you want. And you're just pulling that same thread off over and over and over again. And so what happens is, and I'm going to create a very interesting analogy here for you, because this is a discussion that Chris and I had, and I get where he's coming from. There is this thing about precision in bourbon and Tennessee whiskey and creating a consistent product and letting the barrel do the work. But in Scotch whiskey, the barrel isn't always going to be where the flavor comes from. Glen Scotia, perfect example, drinking it straight off the still. It is fruity, it's amazing, and didn't need a barrel. It could do it all on its own. How does that happen when what I tasted in the American Single Malt off of the column still was kind of like, it's got a nice body to it, but there's not a lot of flavor going on. It feels like it needs to be finished or something needs to happen to it. And so the thing is that in my analogy, let's talk about a CD or an MP3. I like to say CD because CD is a little bit more pure sound, whereas MP3s are usually lower processed rates. A CD versus a record. Column distillation is a CD. You get a chance to just pull off exactly what you want. You're not getting you're not getting distortion in it. You're not getting surface noise, analog noise, none of that stuff. A record, for some reason, to some people, not everybody, but to some people, believe me, I've lived through pops and scratches and surface noise that drives you crazy because records degrade over time. But a record has a certain element to it that you can't get out of a CD, which is there is actual analog friction going on there, and it creates a resonance and a feel that no digital product can quite 100% match. And so, I mean, it's interesting because I went to school for recording engineering, and in the 80s, we were trying as hard as we could to make that tape that we were recording on sound as perfect as we possibly could. But once we took it over to digital, and now I'm working on computers and doing my music mixing on computers, you're adding all sorts of effects to try to recreate the saturation that you used to get out of tape, because it creates a much fuller kind of a sound. And same with a record, you kind of get some surface agitation going on that creates a interesting character that isn't perfect, but it adds some personality. And so to me, the pot still on American Single Malt adds personality, whereas being precise like a CD on a column still and trying to pull off that perfect thin slice, yes, it is fantastic, it's consistent, it's going to do the same thing every single time you get it. What it's not going to do is it's not going to give you the personality that those people who are audiophiles that love vinyl and never want to listen to a CD are going to be missing. So it's really a personality thing. Honestly, I'm glad we're in the CD world. I'm glad we're in the digital world, because I grew up with records, and I can tell you that they were frustrating at best. You go buy a new album, you put it on your turntable, and it's skipping. And you're like, what the heck is it skipping for? And now, after a while, you buy certain things. I remember I bought a 45, and I'm giving away my age here, but I bought a 45 of I Was Made for Loving You by Kiss. And it's on Casablanca Records, and you put the needle on it, and after a few plays, the vinyl was so cheap that basically you'd start getting this hissing noise in the background where the needle was wearing a groove into the record. So, it's not something I want to go back to. But in the world of American Single Malts, I want those imperfections. I want to taste beyond just that thin slice range. So it will be very interesting to see, because Jim Beam is coming out with an American Single Malt at some point, and so is Jack Daniels, maybe. I'm not going to say 100%, but it was tossed out there that there is more coming to this Bonded series. But I think off of a column still, it's gonna force having to have something else in the process, something with those barrels that's going to change the flavor of that distillate, because it was drinkable, but it lacked personality. And so as part of a blend, I think it actually does a nice job of maybe tempering some notes. If you're a Gentleman Jack fan and you want to jump into the Bonded series, I would start the triple mash. It's going to be stronger. It's going to have more personality to it, but it's not going to be as aggressive and in your face as the Bonded version of the whiskey. I hope this was entertaining for you. I sat there while Chris was talking about malted barley and saying, it really doesn't have much going on with it. And I'm thinking there's a whole Scotch whiskey industry out there. There's a whole American Single Malt industry out there that's getting a lot of flavor out of barley and nut. And they're putting it in used bourbon barrels. So it's not like it's getting a lot of flavor out of the barrels. The flavor is coming from somewhere, and I couldn't put the two together until I came up with that little CD versus record analogy. Because, it's amazing how different industries, you can correlate things from one industry to the next. Because in the universe, there's really only so many formulas, and they kind of cross between different creative avenues. But anyway, more actually really nice on the nose the second time I'm jumping in, with that nice Herbaly Rye coming in. I'm glad I put my nose back to it. And then again, maybe another whiskey that, again, you let set for a little while, and this is going to start giving you more and more. I'm almost getting like a graham cracker kind of a note out of it. Or honey grams, maybe that's it. Yeah, very nice. Little char in there. This one is one that's probably going to be more of something that, as you nose it and taste it, there's going to be more subtleties that come out of it. So I hope you enjoyed this, and a little cola note came in there too. Interesting. So that is my review on the triple mash, and price point on this, by the way, is going to be a little bit more than the Bonded, but it still sounds like it's going to be in the $30 range somewhere. So, and again, highly available whiskey, and one that is very fascinating and something you might want to check out. So until next time, cheers, and Slàinte. Yeah, nice range of flavors in there. Definitely one to sit with.